300 soldiers marched into battle, organized entirely into pairs, each man fighting beside his lover. Not hidden away from public view, not whispered about quietly in private. Officially structured that way, on purpose, by the very state that trained and funded them. For roughly 3 decades, this unit was considered essentially unbeatable, and its reputation as one of the fiercest fighting forces anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean rested specifically on that exact structure, not despite it, not in spite of it, but because of it directly. This was the Sacred Band of Thebes, and it existed roughly 2,400 years ago, right in the political and cultural heart of classical Greece. Here's why that single fact should genuinely surprise you more than it probably does at first. Ancient societies had every practical reason, at least on paper, to try eliminating same-sex relationships entirely if they'd wanted to. Population growth mattered enormously to a civilization's long-term military and economic strength. Every additional citizen, a potential soldier or farmer. Inheritance and lineage mattered intensely to nearly every ancient legal system ever recorded, property and titles passing carefully down bloodlines. And yet, across civilization after civilization, completely unconnected to each other, separated by entire oceans and centuries of unrelated history, some version of same-sex desire, same-sex behavior, or a recognized departure from strict gender roles keeps resurfacing in the historical record, openly documented, sometimes formally institutionalized at the highest levels of the state itself. One honest caveat before going further, because it matters. These examples aren't all evidence of one single, identical thing. A formalized mentorship bond between an older Greek citizen and a younger one, a Roman relationship structured around social status rather than gender, and an indigenous social role tied to spirituality and gender expression are genuinely different phenomena, shaped by entirely different concepts of family, age, status, and gender that don't map neatly onto modern categories like sexual orientation. What connects them isn't that they're secretly the same thing. It's that in every one of these unrelated societies, something outside the strict, narrow reproductive pairing that population growth would supposedly demand kept surfacing anyway, openly, without being erased. Start with Greece, because the surviving evidence there is some of the most detailed and best preserved anywhere in the entire ancient world. In Athens, a formalized mentorship relationship between an older man and a younger one, part educational, part explicitly romantic, was woven directly into how upper-class boys were raised, educated, and gradually trained for public and civic life. Plato's Symposium, one of the most influential philosophical texts ever written in any language, treats love between men as a legitimate, even genuinely elevated subject, worth serious, sustained intellectual discussion, sitting comfortably alongside formal debates about beauty, virtue, and the fundamental nature of the soul itself. In Sparta, similar mentorship bonds between men were considered a normal, expected part of a soldier's development, tied directly into military training rather than kept carefully separate from it as some private matter. None of this operated purely as a secret subculture confined to the margins of Greek life, tolerated quietly but never discussed. Much of it was documented openly in philosophy, in formal law, in painted pottery sold in ordinary markets, discussed with a degree of openness that would surprise most people looking back at it today. And the Sacred Band of Thebes took that same broad cultural pattern already present across Greek society, and built an entire deliberate military strategy directly around it. The reasoning, according to surviving ancient sources, was fairly straightforward on its face. A soldier fighting beside the person he loved most in the world would fight harder, retreat less readily, and protect his partner with absolutely everything he had left to give. For roughly 3 decades, the unit's actual battlefield record backed that theory up convincingly and repeatedly, right up until it was finally destroyed fighting to the very last man against Philip II of Macedon, reportedly still standing in tight formation when they finally fell together. Which raises an obvious question. Was this just a Greek quirk, isolated to one culture at one moment in history? Stick around, because the exact same basic pattern shows up in civilizations that had no contact with Greece whatsoever. In ancient Egypt, A tomb dated to roughly 2400 BCE, centuries before classical Greece even properly existed as a recognizable civilization, belongs to two men named Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, both senior officials serving directly in the royal court. The tomb's painted artwork depicts the two men in poses nearly identical to those conventionally reserved elsewhere in Egyptian funerary art for married couples specifically, standing close together, embracing, noses touching in the traditional Egyptian gesture reserved for genuine intimacy. Scholars still actively debate the precise nature of their relationship today, but the imagery itself, deliberately preserved, carved carefully to last for eternity in a culture that took its afterlife with total seriousness, tells you plainly that this wasn't something either man or the artists who made it felt any need to hide or quietly erase from the permanent historical record. Move forward to Rome, an empire running its own completely separate legal and social structure from anything in Egypt or Greece, and the same underlying pattern holds again, simply organized differently to fit Roman priorities. Roman society drew its sharpest social lines around status and formal role, far more than around the gender of a person's partner. Several emperors had well-documented male partners over the centuries, most famously Hadrian, whose relationship with a young man named Antinous was public enough that after Antinous' untimely death, Hadrian had entire cities founded specifically in his memory and had him formally deified across the empire. Temples constructed in his honor and coins minted bearing his image, circulating in ordinary Roman pockets for generations afterward. That's not a relationship anyone in power seemed to be quietly attempting to erase or minimize. That's a relationship commemorated with the full, deliberate machinery of imperial propaganda near its peak. Now travel completely outside the Mediterranean world entirely, to a civilization with zero contact with any of the previous examples, and the pattern still holds. In Han Dynasty China, running an entirely separate philosophical, legal, and imperial tradition thousands of miles removed from anything happening in Athens or Rome, a story recorded directly in official court histories describes Emperor A and his companion Dongxian. According to the account, the emperor woke one morning to find his own sleeve trapped underneath Dongxian, who was still peacefully asleep beside him. Rather than wake him by pulling it free, the emperor simply cut off his own sleeve to avoid disturbing him even slightly. That single small gesture gave rise to an entire poetic tradition afterward, the passion of the cut sleeve, a phrase used respectfully for centuries across Chinese literature as a recognized, dignified way to refer to love between men, embedded directly into the literary vocabulary of an empire that developed its own philosophy, its own legal code, and its own entire cultural framework with essentially zero contact with the Mediterranean world. And travel across an ocean neither Greece, Rome, Egypt, nor China had any practical way of reaching at all, and something related, though genuinely distinct, appears once again, completely independently, across a number of indigenous nations throughout North America, long before any European contact ever took place. Many communities recognize specific social and spiritual roles, often described today using the modern umbrella term two-spirit, for individuals whose gender expression or life role fell outside a strict male-female framework. It's worth being precise here rather than folding this into the same box as the other examples. Two-spirit status was primarily a recognized social and spiritual role within a community, not a direct equivalent to Greek mentorship, Roman status-based relationships, or the Chinese court tradition described earlier, and it didn't map onto modern ideas of sexual orientation in any simple, one-to-one way. What it does show, on its own terms, is that at least some of these societies built formal, respected space for gender and relationships that didn't fit a narrow binary, long before colonization ever reached their land, documented later by anthropologists working directly alongside tribal elders describing traditions that predated any outside contact. So look at what's actually sitting behind all of this. Once you line every single example up side by side, 5 civilizations, 5 continents worth of separate history, each with its own distinct concept of gender, status, and relationship structure. Greece, Egypt, Rome, China, and indigenous North America never once compared notes with each other, never traded a single idea across those particular borders on this particular subject. They developed entirely separate religions, entirely separate legal systems, entirely separate languages, entirely separate ideas about family structure, property rights, gender, and inheritance. What connects them isn't a single identical phenomenon repeating itself 5 times over. It's that in every one of these completely unconnected societies, something departing from strict, narrow, reproduction-only pairing kept surfacing anyway. Whether that was a mentorship bond, a status-based relationship, a court romance, or a recognized social role, and none of it was hidden away. It was documented directly in official court histories, carved permanently into royal tombs meant to last for eternity, built structurally into military doctrine at the state level, celebrated openly in respected poetry, and recognized formally within community and spiritual life. No ancient legal code, no religious authority, no military ruler anywhere on Earth ever actually succeeded in making all of this disappear completely, and plenty of them genuinely tried at various points across history, in various places, for various stated reasons of their own. Some version of it kept resurfacing anyway, generation after generation, civilization after civilization, in societies that otherwise agreed on almost nothing else about how to properly organize a family, a government, or an army. But maybe that's actually the wrong question to have been asking this entire time. The real question was never simply, why didn't antiquity manage to eliminate this? That framing quietly assumes elimination was always the natural, default outcome. The thing any sufficiently organized society should have eventually achieved if it tried hard enough or cared enough. Nothing in the historical record actually supports that assumption. 5 unconnected civilizations, working with 5 entirely different legal systems, 5 different religions, 5 different ideas about family and gender, never once landed on elimination as the obvious solution, even when they had every stated reason and every available tool to attempt it. Maybe the better question isn't why something so persistent managed to survive against the odds. It's why anyone ever assumed a society organized around reproduction would need to erase every relationship, identity, or form of intimacy that didn't directly serve it in the first place. History alone can tell you that it happened, repeatedly, in places that never spoke to each other. It can't fully tell you why the pattern runs that deep, or whether something even older than any of these written records is quietly sitting underneath all of it.